afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Elves. I have medium brown hair and a bit of gray on the sides, and I'm wearing large white frame glasses and a nice big fluffy white sweater for these New England days. I will also be your moderator for today's webinar on accessibility and research administration, enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. I have two special guests joining us here from Canada for today's webinar. Kathy Malcolm Edwards from Carleton University and David Phipps of York University. Welcome. Kathy Malcolm Edwards leads the coordinated accessibility strategy at Carleton University as part of the Accessibility Institute. She engages in action project, participates in research, and is a knowledge mobilizer. Kathy brings with her more than 25 years of experience working with research and educational environment. She's passionate about using her skills in design, planning, and effective communication to support more inclusive and compassionate experiences. Kathy holds a Master's of Design for which she explored the campus-built environment and student mental health. Thank you, Kathy. And Dr. Phipps is the administrator programs and their impact on local and global communities at York University, located in Toronto, Canada. He has received honors and awards from York University, the Canadian Association of Research Administrators, the Society for Research Administration International, Institute for Knowledge Mobilization, International Network of Research Management Societies, and the European Union-based Knowledge Economy Network. He has received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for his work in knowledge and mobilization and research impact, and was named the most influential knowledge mobilizer in Canada. He sits on knowledge mobilization committees around the world and is Network Director for Research Impact in Canada. Welcome, Kathy and David, and thank you for being with us. Let's get started. Kathy and David, please tell us about yourself.
Thanks so much, Jay. I'm going to do a little bit of more of an intro about myself that tied in with a land acknowledgement, and then David will do the same. So my name is Kathy. I often go by Kath. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a settler on the lands of the Algonquin in an area that is known as Ottawa in Ontario, Canada. This is a land that has nurtured me the majority of my life. My family is a settler on this land. We come from the area of Slovakia, as well as some Scottish descent. I'm second generation Canadian on my mom's side. I identify as a white middle-aged female who has disabilities that are dynamic, both visible and non-visible, and episodic. I have short, light brown hair. I'm wearing blue glasses and wearing a gray shirt. I'm really excited about this topic today. As Jay had mentioned, I lead the accessibility strategy for our university, for Carleton University, for the last 5 years. And in that time, I've also sat on our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council for the university. I've also worked in research administration, which I did for about 15 years, working on the larger scale grants, multi-million-dollar ones, as well as social innovation, which is what eventually connected me to Research Impact Canada and to Dr. David Phipps. Over to you, David.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you, Jay, for the introductions. My name is David. My pronouns are he and him. I was born to white parents in England, and we immigrated to these lands that some people call Canada when I was 2 years old. I live in Toronto with my husband, and that's on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the current treaty holders of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am neurotypical. I have no visible or invisible disabilities. I'm a caregiver for my 94-year-old mother who has complex physical needs. I am 60 years old. I've got curly gray hair. I'm sitting in this room with a brown sweater over a light colored shirt. Some of the stuff that I bring to this table is I was on the steering committee for the President's Advisory Council on DEDI, which for us is Decolonizing Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I penned the Decolonizing Research Action Plan for the university and implemented that action plan with the Associate VP Indigenous Initiatives. And I developed and delivered Black and Indigenous research seed grants. And it is a delight to be here to present with my wonderful friend and colleague, Kathy Edwards.
Thanks, David. I want to also take a moment to acknowledge, while David and I are here, the work that we're presenting and ideas we're presenting today actually involve two other individuals. One of them is a colleague of mine at Carleton University, Jessie Gunnell, and she's worked in the area of accessibility as well as student accommodation for over 10 years. And also Jeffrey Edwards, who is an independent consultant who is an executive coach and works in an area related to emotional intelligence in particular. And so I just want to give thanks for them for being here as a part of what we're presenting today. I also wanted to make a note. You may hear David and I refer to EDIA, and this is often the acronym we use in Canada, which is DEIA in a lot of areas in the States. So if you hear us using that interchangeably, it's referring to the same topic. We also made an intentionality of talking about and focusing on accessibility, but within the context of talking about inclusion more broadly, because it is difficult to separate out those topics. Personal opinion, I don't think they should be separated out. So I think we need to be as broad as possible when we're talking about inclusion and accessibility being a part of that. So just an outline of what we're going to cover today. We'll do a bit of an introduction, which we've gone through. We might do a little bit of engagement with the audience as well, just to do some icebreakers. We're going to also look at the importance of accessibility in research administration, identify some strategies for DEIA, in particular, looking at the role of influence and emotional intelligence. We'll take a little dive into accessibility and inclusion in research administration, as well as cover some emerging concepts and recommendations. We're hoping that by the end of our time together today, there may be a bit more of an understanding, personal understanding of what ableism is and how to recognize it in your research administration practice. Understand the importance of accessibility and the role that plays in combating ableism, as well as enhance your professional and personal commitment to your own DEIA practice. So we're going to do a little bit of an exercise to get to use the Zoom poll feature. So we're wanting to find out a little bit about who is in the room. So the first question we're asking is, it's 8 a.m. Monday morning. What kind of beverage are you reaching for? Is it a coffee, a tea, soda, or other? Now,
Jay,
David,
what would you reach for, Jay?
Jay?
I would reach for a coffee.
Yeah, I'm a tea drinker. Never touch coffee.
Uh,
Oh, it looks like
I'm a
Jay and I have a
majority.
lot of friends. Yeah,
98
we've got coffee.
We got coffee. 98 of 158 participants love their coffee.
Absolutely.
I'm
These are my
curious what the
people.
other would be. Would they be their phone or news?
They grab their phone. That's the first thing they do at 8 in the morning. Reach for
True.
your phone.
True that.
Good one, Jay.
So another question, to understand that there are professional superpowers that we carry. And so we're going to find out a little bit about professional superpowers that we have around us today in the room. So the first is A, empathy, B, systems thinking, C, creativity, D, grit, E, decisiveness, and F, other. And this is a single answer. So choose what your biggest professional superpower is.
Kathy, can you just give a bit more, a couple seconds on superpower?
Yeah, I think there's this innate vibe and experience and skill set that you're bringing to the table that just identifies you and has you stand out, and you bring it to your everyday professional practice. For myself, for instance, it's empathy is, I would say, my biggest, is
Thank
my
you.
superpower.
And now I observe that there's 15 folks who put something in other. If one of you are interested, you could put what your superpower is in the Q&A, and then our moderators will be able to look at the Q&A and we'll be able to read out what your superpower is. So of those 15 people, feel free to include your superpower in the Q&A. And while you're doing that, I think my superpower, oh gosh,
Mhm.
I don't know, Kathy, what do you think? You know me well. Is it creative thinking or grit?
Well, I was going to go between those two. I think I would go with creative thinking, though.
I'm a C.5.
Yes, exactly.
Now,
Exactly. A C and a half.
Latasha or Megan, do we have any other superpowers in the chat?
Hi,
Or in the
yes,
Q&A?
we're
There is.
seeing folks that have identified patience and
Oh.
finding
Mhm.
silver linings.
Oh, I like that. The silver
Oh,
linings.
We've also
yes.
got humor. That's another one
Yes.
that's coming.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Mine
Those
is
are great.
observation. I'm
What's
deaf
that,
in
Jay?
one ear, so I rely on my ears and my sight over my ears. So observation is my super.
Nice. Thank you. Kathy, yours is empathy, right?
100%. Yes.
Nice. I'd say 110% for Kathy.
Thank you. I see. I'm feeling like I said, I feel like there's some of my people here in this room, with 55 or 35%, identifying with empathy. And these are important. Their superpowers are important because they're going to tie in to when we start talking about our influence and our emotional intelligence a little bit later on, and our base skill sets that we bring.
Great. Kathy, just before we go on, Megan, is there something you wanted to mention about the interpretation?
Yes, we initially had some technical difficulties turning the interpretation feature on. It is now back on. So if you would like the ASL interpretation, it will be now appearing in the bottom of your screen on the control panel. If you click on the interpretation option, which may be appearing under the More option, you should have the option to turn on American Sign Language. That will appear in a separate pane, which you'll be able to move around and resize as needed.
Thanks, Megan. Kathy, sorry to interrupt.
No worries at all. No worries at all. So our last who is in the room question we have is, when it comes to your own DEIA practice, are you a Padawan, meaning a beginner, B, a Jedi Master, meaning that you're established, or C, somewhere in between?
And you know, Kathy, it's
David?
interesting. I'm glad you put beginner and established, because I did something like this, and in a different, I can't honestly remember where it was, but Padawan and Jedi Master did not translate. Like, it was not it was not terms that were easily understood by the participants. So I'm glad you put the beginner and established. I don't know, I
I'm
think
not a sci
yeah,
I'm not sci-fi person myself, so but I do know a Padawan and a Jedi Master when I see them.
there you
Yes.
go. You know, I think even though I've done a lot of this, I always seem to think I'm at the beginning, because I'm always learning about this.
Mm,
Jay, where would you
interesting. And
be?
yeah.
I would agree. I think it's an evolving process, so I'm somewhere in between as well.
Well, we've got
Yeah,
some
in the
self-identifying
majority.
Jedi Masters. That's very cool. And
Yes.
Jedi Masters, we welcome anyone's not interruptions, but some interjections. And Jedi Masters, we would enjoy hearing from you as well throughout the process.
Absolutely. I think for ourselves in our commitment to this work is a commitment that comes with a great deal, or try to come with a great deal of humility. Um, Even though I have experience and positionality to the topic, it's my positionality which comes with its own bias, and I'm constantly learning and evolving. So I love that Veronica added that into the Q&A as well. She's saying there's always room for improvement, and views herself as being in the somewhere in between stage. So Thanks for playing, everyone. That's great. It gives us an idea of some of the people that have joined us today, and which is always useful when we're doing a webinar. I want to take a moment to share a bit of a personal reflection for myself, but would encourage you to reflect on this as well. That we acknowledge and reflect that there's a pivotal role that accessibility for persons with disabilities plays in an equitable research enterprise. And I think it's important that we reflect on the nuances in language, behavior, and power dynamics, and the role that those have in creating inclusive environments. I believe that DEIA is crucial when talking about accessibility and the idea of intersecting identities. For these intersecting identities compound experiences of marginalization for all equity deserving people. This is crucial in order to be able to address aspects of a personal identity and how we advocate, how we use our allyship, and address some systemic barriers that might be occurring in our systems. A lot of what we're presenting today stems from a paper that David and I had the pleasure of writing with Jesse and Jeff. And one of the things that we also we did at the time in the workshop that was the precursor to the paper, we reviewed some of the accessible practices, and I just wanted to share some of the ones that we're trying to incorporate today, and including the reason why we're doing that. A big part of how Jesse has coached me as well in terms of how we approach accessibility is that we share why we're doing something. When people understand the why, they're more likely to attach to it and then build it into a part of their practice. So we made an effort to make electronic materials screen reader friendly. And this allows people to be able to use their screen readers or other assistive devices. And it enables people to have independent access to information. I'm hopeful that the materials were made available in advance of what we were shooting for, but if not, the materials will be made available. This is important because sharing materials ahead of time reduces the impact of processing speed. We're trying to bring in multiple ways to engage in the session. So some have participated through the Q&A, through polls, and we're trying to be able to be mindful that not everybody will engage the same way. And this is helpful to improve our overall understanding and recall. We're using microphones and trying to address any noise-related barriers that may interrupt in the webinar. We have ASL interpreters and access to closed captioning, which helps for pacing of information, as well as people that benefit from visual cues. I myself, I use closed captioning as a part of processing information for myself because I'm often running either too far behind or too far ahead. And lastly, we're trying to bring a flexible mindset. This allows us to be adaptive to the needs of those who are here today and trying to create a space, even though we're separated in some ways because of the webinar approach, to ensure that the participants that are here feel included and have an equitable opportunity to participate in the offering today. So these are just some examples of practices that we are trying to shoot for that would be useful for you to carry forward into your own practice.
And Kathy, in a couple of slides, I'm going to ask you to return to this slide.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks, David. So we're talking about ableism, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to discuss what it is. It is a large concept that can be broken down. It essentially is the discrimination against disabled people in favor of people who do not have a disability. It marginalizes and diminishes the participation of disabled people, and it takes away their agency. And agency is an extremely important concept. When you think about having the choice, the freedom of choice to do something. So being able to decide if you do want to participate in an activity rather than having the barriers there from the beginning that prevent you from being able to participate. When you don't have a sense of agency, it actually denies dignity of individuals with disabilities. And it does this because it impacts how we process the human experience and the level to which I'm able to assert my own independence or be able to govern my own decisions and my own pathway through life. So it's when you take actions and subscribe to ableist thinking, ableist systems, which we are all a part of, and being somebody with a disability, I am a part of it as well. I've internalized these messages that have happened in society. And it influences the way I see myself. It influences my belief in my abilities, my sense of being able to make decisions or feel like I have that level of independence in my life. When that happens, it denies the very sense of self that I have and becomes a part of the conversation that happens in my head, and it skews the way not only I interact with the world, but the way I think of myself. And so it's important to understand and kind of sit with this concept when we go through talking about accessibility, because accessibility becomes a tool in how we can counteract ableism that we're encountering in our daily lives. So I'll just pause for a moment and see. I think we're going to check with Jay to see if there are any questions that have come in so far.
I do. There are some questions in the chat here. So some that have asked if anyone is actually free from internalized negative messages they get from society. And also, I had a question about what are ways that we can help acknowledge a disability without making them calling out, like without making them stand out. Like for some example, I will speak to somebody directly if they as one way. What are yours?
Wow, these are great questions. So I'll address that first one. Is anyone free from internalizing the negative messages? I don't think so. I think we're all impacted by those messages, for sure. When you're already facing barriers and you're already been pushed to the margins of society, I think the impact that those voices might have may be a bit stronger, and are continually reinforced not only through individual or societal thoughts, but through systemic structures that are set up to be ableist from the beginning. And so there is no escaping it. It is there and you're encountering it on a regular basis. And that's speaking from my experience and my positionality as somebody with a disability, but I can't speak for all in that case. And Jay, you asked a question about, I need a cue because I couldn't access my recall.
What are some things we could do to help either colleagues or friends with either a parent or not a parent disabilities so that we can make them feel included?
I would say
that's a really good example.
Yeah, it's really good. And you know, who asked the question? I'd invite you to bring that question back at the end, because I think we will be presenting some of these opportunities for learning. So please bring that back to the end if there's more information you'd like to get.
Will do.
Excellent, thank you. So Kathy, in the next slide, please. So how do we move beyond ableism and thinking of its role in our lives as in research administration? And it's interesting, the importance of accessibility in research administration. It's a bit of an artificial separation because it's important in every career, in every job, but we are research administrators. As I said, so we as research administrators need to commit to a more profound notion of inclusivity. It's one that transcends representation. So by that, it means, it transcends what we might be presenting and to things where we might not be presenting some of our identities. One way to advance the effort is to embrace the power of accessibility, recognizing that through thoughtful design and meaningful conversations, we improve representation by dismantling barriers and by fostering an environment where individuals with disabilities can fully engage and participate. And so this, it means that this is good for you. It's good for your office. It's good for your research and the partners and those people who are taking part in research, that accessibility will have these ripple effects throughout your life, throughout your work life and your personal life. And I'll use an example, what I call low curbing. So when you get to an intersection and you're on the sidewalk and the curb slopes down so you can more easily get to the street. That was, at least in Canada, was done, gosh, Kathy, back 70s or 80s, something like that. And was done with thinking about people with mobility devices in mind. But if you're pushing a pram or baby carriage, or if you're walking along with a shopping basket on wheels, low curbing helps you as well. When I'm walking to the subway to get to the airport and I'm dragging my wheelies to get onto a plane, low curbing helps me. Right, so that accessibility more broadly will have more benefits than just helping you in your research administration. Next slide, Kathy. But in research administrators, what can we do? So really, I encourage you to think of accessibility in two ways, thinking of the work that we do to support researchers. So this might be creating opportunities to work with researchers who have lived and living experiences with disabilities themselves, and also helping them think about accessibility within their research programs. And how do you then reflect that in their grant applications if you're a pre-award person, or reflect that in ethics protocols if you're working in ethics and compliance. So it's directly relevant to our work in helping researchers, but in your own office as either a leader or a staff person or a colleague in your offices, we can practice slide 10. I'm going to ask Kathy to go back to that. We can practice slide 10 to not only help our researchers do their work, but help our colleagues do their work in our offices. I'm not going to go through all of these again, but because we've seen them, but I just want to go to the one of use of microphones, because I see this not happening all the time, where you'll be in a room, and especially if, I can see it with researchers, we love them. Oh, I don't need a microphone. I can just use my lecture voice. But you might not need the microphone, but someone else might. You don't know who's in your audience, and it's not appropriate to say, hey, could you raise your hand if you need me to use the mic? We should be using the microphone all the time, and especially depending on the technology in the room, they might have a hearing loop or something that is tied into the audio system, right? So that's just something. Use your microphones and encourage faculty to use their microphones. So,
and David, if I can just jump in on that as well, we're getting hearts and thumbs up coming up. This is awesome. I think it's also important that when we're considering accessibility, that we're not necessarily making assumptions about who is in the room, like you were saying. For instance, the most logical, I think for myself, and it's my own bias, I see use of microphones and I think, oh, that's for people maybe who have a hearing impairment. And so we should use microphones because it helps them. While that is true, there's a lot of non-apparent or non-visible disabilities that would also benefit from having microphones. So for instance, I have issues with information processing, and microphone allows for a clearer sound that is something that allows me then to be able to process the information that I'm receiving. Or it can help with overcoming background noise, which could be distracting to different people, maybe who identify as neurodivergent. And so by using these accessible practices, it also puts the power for the individual to not have to declare their disability. Just by having these be our common practices, it allows more freedom and sense of agency for someone who is disabled.
Thank you, Kathy. And I'm going to go to the last one as well, just a bit of reflection, because the first 5 bullets are things that you can do. The last one is kind of a thing that you can be, right? And you can have an open mind. You can be open to other possibilities and other ways of being and other ways of knowing. And I think that flexibility, that flexible mindset really creates a space where you can then do all of the first 5 bullets, which are things you can do, are enabled by a thing that you can be or the person you can be. So Kathy, if I wonder if you could take me back to slide 13, which is titled, What Can Research Administrators Do? And then go to the next slide, please. So the next poll is asking, what do you bring to the table? What best describes, so again, finding out about your role. We've asked you about what you like to drink in the morning, but what best describes your role in research enterprise, research administrator, research compliance, research development, tech transfer, researcher, other, lots of other opportunities. You might be in compliance, you might be in ethics, you might be in post-award, you might be in procurement. Jay, where would you sit on these options?
I am a research administrator at a central level for several small departments.
Excellent. And Kathy, when you were in research administrations, I know you were for 15 years. What space would you play or did you sit in?
I would say more research development myself. So I worked a lot on the front ends of applications. So as a facilitator, and working in idea generation and development, and not necessarily what happens after the fact.
Cool. And Megan, what do we look like? Woohoo! To research admins, yay! And no one from tech transfer and no researchers in the room, or at least not identifying.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And Kathy, on the next slide, please. We have another poll, and this is great because this is really helping us understand who's in the room and where you are. So accessibility in research administration, what DEIA skill sets do you bring or do you want to bring to your team? And this is multiple choice. Kathy, I think that means they can choose multiple options. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Excellent. So let's see, if I was to do, what skill set would I bring? Well, we already know that Kathy's superpower is empathy, so I'm sure she's going to bring that. Do you know, I think I would be another, because being an assistant vice president, I've got a lot of opportunity at the leadership level to try and do leadership around accessibility. That would be, I think I would be an other in that regard.
I think since this is a multi-answer one for myself, I would say that I bring self-awareness, self-regulation, and empathy to the table. I balance out well with others that take action and are social. I am big introvert.
Check all the boxes, Kathy. You can check them all.
Okay, I'm all of them.
I guess, and I would, looking at this, I would sort of, for me, I would want to be enabling action. I'd certainly take action, but enabling action of others would be a piece I'd want to do. And Jay, let's see, what do we have? Ooh, empathy. Kathy, your people are here.
My people. I'm so excited.
And self-awareness. Jay, where would you be? Which one or more than one would you choose?
Oh, definitely more than one, but definitely on the empathy side and the self-awareness side. Also a bit of social skills depending on the situation. If I feel confident enough to say, excuse me, I'm deaf, could I get a little bit more help here? But again, that depends on that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of those. Kathy, the next one is, yes, Kathy?
I was just going to say, do you want to take a little pause to see if there's some questions that have come in?
Yeah, sure. We could do that.
Okay.
Thanks for that nudge.
Yeah, no problem.
Jay, anything in the chat or Q&A?
We have a lot here. So I'll take this one here. When you talk about accessibility, where does physical, internal, and external structures fit in?
Oh, now this is somebody I want to have a conversation with. I want to be able to probe this question a little bit more. So where I need to bring up this question for myself. I'm going to talk out loud while I'm doing this just to explain that I have some queuing issues. And so I need to see the question in order to be able to process it.
Jay, where's the question? Is it in the chat or is it in the Q&A?
Oh, it's now there in the chat. So thanks very much, Megan.
Okay.
I think that I'm going to make the assumption that maybe when they're talking about structures, they're talking about barriers to a certain extent. And I think that where does physical, internal, and external structures fit? I think that there are certain elements that we bring to the table from an accessibility point of view where we can talk about the physical barriers that are being experienced, but there are non-physical barriers that are experienced as well. I think maybe is what they're trying to get at here. And so I think that we spend 93% of our time, I believe it is, in the built environment. And so having accessible environments is extremely important to us when we're talking about the structures that way. But I think we also bring to that other structures such as policies, practices that are also important elements that need to be addressed because they also perpetuate a lot of stigma and systemic ableism that are in place. Especially, I think, through our own journeys, David, that we've done around inclusion and decolonization as well. We're very aware of the power structures that we are inherently using.
Yeah, and I'll just thank you, Kathy. I think power is it's its own presentation when thinking about power. But I would just also think about when the word internal there, an internal structure. I want to not go back to slide 10, but think about mindset. Right? What is the mindset that we bring to this? And some ableism can be ableism is internal, right? It is something that we bring to the table. So I would say that think about internal is what do we bring as people to the table, and sometimes that's positive, and sometimes that's not positive.
And diminishing beliefs that we carry about ourselves. Some of which are perpetuated by the ableism that we experience. For the longest time for myself, I'll share I have a mobility issue, which is visible if you were to see me walking and moving around, and I have non-visible disabilities related to chronic PTSD, a complex PTSD, I should say. As well as post-concussion syndrome. And these are elements that have really impacted how I view myself in the world and often put the limiter on myself that I can't do something because the limiter has been said to me or has been reinforced to me through behaviors around me. I'm very fortunate that I do a lot of work internally to overcome those. But if the ableism wasn't there in the first place, I'm not sure I would carry those messages of deficiency, if you will, to the extent that I do.
Great, thank you. So Kathy, if we could move on to the next slide. And this is just take a moment to think. This is a personal reflection. No need to add anything in the chat unless you really want to. But time to think of someone that you would work with again if you had the opportunity. Someone who would motivate you. It may be a coworker, a mentor, or a teacher, or a supervisor. So think of that person, then how did that make you feel? And how did that person make you feel? How did working with that person make you feel? Because this personal reflection, I want you to hold on to that person and thinking about that person, because we're going to talk about influence and emotional intelligence. I want you to be thinking about that person as I talk about the next slide. And so in the context of the reflection we've just done, influence is the effect that somebody or something has on the way a person thinks or behaves, or on the way that something works or develops. This could be positive or negative, but we've asked you in this instance to reflect in a positive way. And so thinking about someone who's had that influence on you, how we show up influences how others respond. So how that person in your mind, in your reflection shows up, affects how you will respond. It's an essential component that needs to be understood when talking about creating change, especially regarding accessibility. So using influence, either your influence or how you have been influenced, to promote inclusivity involves modeling behavior, active listening, and communication. It's really about how you show up. And this is true in your office. It's true when you're working with researchers. It's true just when you leave your workspace and you go into your life space. People will respond to your positive influence, but if you make it genuine, right? It doesn't ring true if it's not genuine. So be thinking about that person who we just talked to, asked you to reflect on. And then think then about yourself and how you can be playing this or portraying this influence. And part of that influence is on the next slide, Kathy, is about emotional intelligence. This is understanding the messages sent and received, because there's two messages. When I say something, it's the message I send, but it's the message that Kathy receives. And they're not always that same message. And so emotional intelligence is understanding both of those messages. Your influence, the thing we talked on the previous slide, will be more influential if you can also read the room and understand how the room is reading you. So it's really, and that's actually quite hard to do on a webinar of 207 people when I can only see Jay and Kathy. So it's quite difficult to be actually portraying this directly on Zoom. But so just think about those people from your reflection a couple slides ago, that person. How is that person using their emotional intelligence to be understanding what they're saying to you, but also what you're receiving from them? And here's my suggestion to you is you think about that person. If they're still with you, if they're still around, ask them out for coffee and have a chat. Have a chat about building your own emotional intelligence, because they have it. And I can pretty well assure you that they're willing to share it, because you've demonstrated that they've had such a positive influence on you. Kathy, anything more to add on the influence or emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think for myself, it's important to recognize the vulnerability that's needed to do this. And it reminds me of something that Jay had said earlier about, like, how can you support people who have disabilities and create space for them to be there? And it requires vulnerability. I have to say, I don't know how to do something. I have to be willing to say, I might mess this up, but I'm going to do it anyways. I might have to ask somebody a question about something that makes me uncomfortable. But that level of vulnerability, that willingness to step into that vulnerable space, to me, is where emotional intelligence really shows up.
Right. Thank you so much. And then just on the next slide, the last poll of this section. So individual practices and mindsets. What type of barriers do you see in your role? And we are actually asking you in your role now, you're a research admin role. What do you see? And this can be a multiple choice. Do you see hierarchies? Do you see systemic barriers such as policies? Do you see attitudes, resources? Architectural would be I think, Kathy, architectural is the built environment.
Yes.
Or any other barriers that you might see. And this is specific to your role in research administration. Jay, what are you thinking when you see these? What barriers might you experience in your role?
Most of them that I've seen are usually related to cost But I also see hierarchy. If you're pushing up, you're afraid to push up, so you don't. Uh, been my experience.
Your first one was cost? You say a bit
Yes.
more about cost? Could you say a little bit more about cost?
Sure. So I'm thinking of someone that, like, person who helped me out a lot. I don't hear on my left side, and just something simple like setting in a meeting. This person would just step aside, letting me sit with my good side toward the audience, which is something very simple, didn't cost anything, and I really appreciated that that person recognized that, allowed me to have that seat, without having to. Again, the hierarchy, that was my boss,
Yeah.
but that boss that said, "Oh, this is your seat, you sit here."
Nice.
So that was one way. I realized as an older person, one of the first technologies to come out was a device that goes on a landline phone. Of course, nobody has those anymore, but that was an expense that was a little bit different kind of an expense that we see now. You had to buy this device to magnify the receiver on a phone. Now we have them on everything. So technologies seem to, when they evolve, they will then evolve to be less costly. But the first one always is more expensive.
Thank you, Jay. And how do we see on the poll? Kathy, what do you see on the poll?
I see that a lot of people are indicating attitudes and resources as being the primary barriers, followed closely by hierarchies and systemic ones. Which, what I love about this is when we normally think of barriers, we often think of physical barriers. It's, if you see something, then you're more likely to encounter it as a barrier in terms of your built environment. And yet, when we're talking about accessibility, yes, again, physical accessibility, super important. The idea of if you can't get into a building, then you can't interact with the building on the inside. But the reality is the barriers that we are experiencing often are hidden barriers that or ones that aren't necessarily tangible that you can point to in an easy way, nor is it as simple as deconstructing it. It often requires, there's a complexity to them that requires a lot of people working together.
Right. And I would imagine, just before we move on, that some of these barriers, you talked about complexity, some of these barriers, multiple barriers can exist at the same time. Right. So it's it's not just, oh, I can fix the sidewalk, then everything's good. So these can coexist. So
Absolutely.
I'm going to say thank you so much. I'm not done. I'm going to come back at the end, but I am going to pass this over to Kathy to talk about some of the work that we published in the paper.
I have a question
Yes, Jay.
that came in here. What are some recommendations for accessibility of funding for lower cost professional service resources for individuals with disabilities who work with researchers, such as paying for sign language interpreters during meetings, finding accessible rooms? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about as research administrators?
Excellent. I'll just start by saying that understand, do your poking around your own institution to understand what services are available, because there is, it's easy to sit at my desk in my research admin office, but I'm part of a large institution, and there's a lot of supports around physical accessibility, around mental health supports, and so you don't have to find it, you don't have to do it all on your own. Like a lot of these supports would may exist at your institution. I can't say they do, but they may exist at your institution. But you need to do the work, and I'd say you need to do the work before you need it. So do the work first to understand what other supports exist at your institution before you actually need to tap those resources. Kathy, any other thoughts on that?
That, I think that was a perfect example of what needs to be done. I'm not familiar with the necessarily as well the funding in the states in particular. in terms of how accessibility funding works internal or external to the university, but my first thought would be to check with the institution. Like David said, do the work ahead of time to have that information, and also be aware of what the needs might be, because it's not necessarily going to be a one solution fits all situation. And you may find that, for instance, some individuals maybe are able to use technology or have systems in place that allow them to, that the technology facilitates a more accessible experience. So I think that's a really important question, and it's important to know who it is you're working with.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for that question, Jay, for reading it out, and for the person who put it in the chat. Kathy, I think we should move on to get to the work that you led for the paper.
Well, thanks. So based on this question that we just did the poll on, we saw that a lot of the barriers had to do with attitudes, systemic barriers and hierarchies, as well as access to resources. And I just wanted to share what your Canadian counterparts pointed out when they were going through this exercise that we had done at a conference. And you'll see things that hierarchies and policies were, and attitudinal and systemic barriers were really a big part of what people were facing within their research enterprise. Having worked as a research facilitator and on the research administration side, there are countless amounts of hierarchies that we deal with, both internal and external to the university. And these policies that are in place that have to be followed, that are reflections of the systemic system. So, for instance, one of the simple things that we would encounter all the time is our primary what we call it, electronic system for generating research applications external to the university. So through our federal government, in itself was not actually accessible. And so people with certain disabilities were not actually applying for research funding because the system itself would not allow them to apply for research funding because they couldn't interact with the system. This was based on assumptions and attitudes that were in place regarding, I believe, what a researcher would or wouldn't be able to do, or that people would find a hack around being able to do that. There are definitely hierarchies that are promoted, power that exists in the internal infrastructure of the university. In terms of decisions being made, whether that's on the hiring side or in the promotion of research itself. Time was another barrier that was encountered in the research enterprise. I remember, David, I'm sure your team is like this as well, being run off ragged, especially during high funding season. And there is no time to breathe, barely to submit an actual application. And so I think in those, if we don't have the systems in place that are structured to be able to allow breathing room for more accessible practices in what we're doing, because it can take a little bit more time to do that, then I think we're really doing a disservice to the researchers and the communities that we're working with.
Do you think we need to find alliances? For example, we can't even apply for a blind person or a deaf person or a visually impaired person who can't apply for a grant online. So we would need to find an ally with a principal investigator that can do that for us, right? Okay.
Right. And again, it's that sense, then you're taking away that sense of independence, that sense of agency, that and that eventually you face that enough, that gets internalized into how you view your worth, your contribution. If you're always having to ask for help because you're hitting your head against the wall. At the workshop, we had 16 attendees that highlighted barriers that really then focused on the systemic elements of the enterprise, as well as the functions and the role. The built environment actually came up a bit more in the study, in the session that we had done. Participants expressed challenges related to the absence of a safe space for being able to raise issues that occurred, and policies that could be perceived as being discriminating against people with disabilities. Overall, there was a sentiment that the design of policies tend to be a one-size-fits-all, and this is incongruent with the individualized approach that's often needed. So when we're talking even about that example of being able to have low-cost accessibility options available to support researchers, there is an individualization that often needs to be in place, and the structures around it are designed to try to be a one-size-fits-all piece. There were attitudinal and systemic barriers that were mentioned in 8 of the responses, and this encompassed a lack of interest or flexibility from institutions and other organizations, and the existence of non-trusting work environments. And I think this is really important when we're talking about the vulnerability that we bring to our jobs. And we're existing in a work environment where there are varying levels of trust. But I think that's what David was also alluding to and talking about, the role that influence and emotional intelligence play, that there is, even in a space where we maybe don't have power, there is a space that we exist where we do have influence. And I think it's using that influence to be able to create a more inclusive, accessible environment for ourselves, for our colleagues, and for the clients that we service from a research and min point of view.
Do you have any guidance on finding meeting facilitators or people who truly understand the DEI principle so that they can lead these meetings and conferences? How do we find them or resources?
I think we are them.
Okay, you're right.
I think we are them, and I think that's why it's amazing that organizations like Incur have these webinars, so that we can build up our individual practice. And I think that individual practice comes through reflection, and I think it's somewhat upon us to be able to move beyond that sense of tokenism in the workplace to that sense of authenticity, and it becomes a part of our daily practice and our daily work.
Kathy, I'm just keeping my eye on the time, and we've got about 5
Yep.
minutes left in this section.
Yep, thank you. So who might be impacted by the lack of access? Well, the lack of access actually reflects everyone. And when this came up in our in the session that we did, what we noticed was that there was a ripple effect. And this means that while you may have impact on one person, there's a ripple effect that impacts others. So when you think of who is impacted by a lack of access, it includes clients, partners, staff, researchers, support staff, underrepresented groups. But it also impacts, if you're talking about a person with a disability, while there could be a direct impact on that individual, that can also then have extension that goes to others. So for instance, I know when I'm dealing with a lack of access on a research project that I'm a part of, that creates frustration for me. That frustration has a ripple effect in others around me, and including in my home life. And we noticed that people were bringing up the impact that a lack of access has on family members, particularly of those with disabilities as well, because of the frustration. So I just wanted to share a scenario that we had with them, the group that we had presented to, and to try to anchor this in research practice. So we shared the scenario that's on the screen right now of a research team that's applying for a grant led to urban transportation. And the team was concerned about accessibility and wanted to ensure the study was inclusive and as accessible to as many participants as possible throughout the process. This includes ensuring representation of diversity of disabilities and intersectional identities. So, for example, looking at disabled students from underrepresented communities and finding a way to engage them in the process. So based on that scenario, what we found was what could be done to address DEI concerns at the design of a proposal. So it was important to have diverse team members and partner organizations, as well as community engagement partners. Collaborative planning from the outset of the idea would help address some of the need to ensure diversity within the group. This is intentionality when looking at soliciting input from team members to be able to understand the specific needs and considerations. So examples of consideration in this scenario included things like accessible transportation for everyone to be able to come together for the meeting, utilizing multiple modes of communication. So that could be using emails as well as social media, and looking at how you structured those modes of communications. Providing transcriptions for the meetings, as well as considering childcare requirements for participants. Also essential was having continuous discussion and having of the team's needs and keeping a pulse on where the team was at.
Kathy, could I just use an example that you and I were involved in the development of a grant?
Yes.
This was recently development of a large training grant that we were unsuccessful at. Nonetheless, the principles of building it is that the DEIA was not just about the team construct, and that's often where people will start, well, we've got a diverse team. It was about how to, in the conduct of the project, how are we including accessibility? So we actually requested funding and partnered with the Carleton Accessibility Institute, so that as we were developing the training, we would have an accessibility lens on that. So it would, as you're thinking about supporting researchers in their applications, it's not about just about the team. It's important, but it's about the type of work that is that is going to be undertaken as well. And if there is the opportunity, this is related to the question about where do you find a facilitator, there are sources that will be able to help you out, like we turn to the Carleton Accessibility Institute to be able to help us out. I say, unfortunately, it wasn't successful nonetheless. It's about that type of thinking about how do we help our researchers plan this into their grant applications.
And I think it's having that informed living experience that's a part of that as well. And that was one of the things with the Institute, is that it's founded by people that identify as having disabilities as well as allies, and bringing that knowledge together as a way to help support more inclusive experiences. So we also looked at then how can the team address accessibility during the development of a project. And from this, we found that, as mentioned before, that collaborative planning is an extremely important piece of this. So a lot of times, I know back in my research administration days, it was me sitting alone in a cubicle, and often realizing that it was really important for me to talk with colleagues, to have diverse conversations, to talk to people that not only would agree with me, but would disagree with me, in order to challenge me to create as an inclusive project as possible, or an inclusive environment as possible. The diversity of voices for me is an important piece that sits at the core of the research process. So it's building that core base that allows for the collaborative decisions, for the effective adaptive communication that becomes core to the overall health of the research team. So overall, how can a team engage with diverse communities and voices and include their perspectives? Well, I think that this can be done at all stages of the research grant, from design through to execution and evaluation. It's to assume the diversity of voices across all phases. It empowers diverse voices, needs to be authentic. As David was saying earlier, it needs to be something where it is true and you're walking that walk and talking the talk. It involves living and lived experience in decision-making power and in leadership positions. It encourages us, when we're thinking about diverse community and voices, about considering intersectional identities, because that is, we don't operate and walk in this world as being one identity. I am not just a disabled person. I am a disabled woman, but I'm also so many other aspects of the identity that I bring that we shared at the beginning. And those all inform how I approach and engage with the research. And the onus needs to be on research administrators, on us, to be proactive. When we talk about accessibility, it's about being proactive and in having that thought there from the inception of what we're doing through to the conclusion, and not to put it on equity deserving groups to ask for the inclusion, but allow that space to be there for them in the beginning. So some of the emerging concepts that came to us through the research was that accessibility impacts everyone. Whether you have a disability or not, we are all impacted by it. Having accommodations in place helps facilitate inclusion for persons with disabilities. The barriers and constraints in the research enterprise are pervasive and occur at multiple levels. Accessibility has a ripple effect and an interconnectedness in the projects that we work on. And diversity and inclusion make for a more comprehensive and effective project. When we look at collaborative planning, it allows us to build richer insights. And the last is that communication strategies are crucial considerations in the work that we're doing. David.
Yeah, thanks. Jay, did we want to do a pause for questions, or this is our last slide? Maybe I do this and then we can look at some questions.
That sounds good.
Okay.
So,
So
just go ahead.
Okay, so we're just going to close with some recommendations, and we've covered all of these things. Kathy was just talking about being proactive. Don't wait for someone to have to ask. Be proactive and think about reducing barriers in advance. And so think about that as you're walking through your office. Think about that as you're walking through your life. You know, how do we proactively do this? Just as one example, and I realized I started doing this. Kathy was is part of the Research Impact Canada Network, and we hold an annual meeting. And so back to Kathy, 2019, I think it was, we were hosting the annual meeting in Toronto. So I was involved in finding the restaurants. And I thought, oh, Kathy's with us. I've got to find an accessible restaurant. And it was actually surprisingly difficult to find an accessible restaurant. But then I realized afterwards, I should be doing this anyway, whether it's Kathy or not. I need to be thinking about this ahead of time and thinking about accessibility, whether I know someone will be coming to an event with a visible or invisible disability or not. It should be barrier free, or as barrier free as possible. So do that proactively. Collaboration. Nothing about us without us. Involve the people who are affected by the activity, by the decisions. Involve them in the decision making and make it an authentic involvement. We often see, and this will be something you can take into your advice for researchers, is we often think of an advisory board, whether that's a youth advisory board, a consumer advisory board. Well, just on the nature of it being advisory, there is no power in their decisions. They can only provide advice. So find a way to provide greater decision making and great decision making for the people with lived and living experiences that are going to be involved in the research project. Give them an actual decision voice. Don't advisory board is great, but maybe have a co-applicant who is someone with lived and living experiences. Make if you've got if you have a board of directors of your large research center, maybe you can have co-directors and not just have the people who typically hold the power, the academic, as being the sole decision maker. So think about that with collaboration and making it authentic. And then, as we've all talked, with going right back to the beginning where we said, are you a Padawan or are you a Jedi Master? We're all in the moment of continuous improvement, and we've all got opportunities to learn. And so just to, I don't provide advice, but my suggestion is what we've already said is that find out you don't have to do this on your own. There's supports for you at your institution. So find out where those supports are and continue on your learning journey. Kathy, this is all we had to say before we turn it to the participants. Any closing thoughts from you?
I just really enjoyed this time and space. I'm appreciative that you shared that example from back in 2019 and how the learning that happened for that and how important it was. I can share the personal experiences. One, I was really appreciative that you were vulnerable enough to have a conversation with me. And regarding accessibility and what would work for me. And then flash forward to 2024, then there was just an assumption that we needed to be able to make a space as accessible as possible, rather than it's Kathy going to be here, so now we need to do these things. And it was amazing to see the growth in the organization in Research Impact Canada over that time, in terms of creating a space where I felt seen and welcomed and didn't have to be worrying about, am I going to be able to participate? What will I need to have with me? Do I need to use my rollator one day? Do I need my crutches? It was just there, and I felt so seen, and that was so powerful and influenced the experience that I had.
I thought they had, thank you, Kathy, that was, thanks. So here's a thought when the point that you were making about how to find the allies and resources to design the research. One thought I had was that some employees and universities have these colleague or employee resource group for veterans or Abilities Plus, or, so that might be one resource. I also had a question here in the chat. How do we think about barriers folks might have to accessibility without them sharing? Is there some good checklist or articles that you could share?
So some of the references in the slides do get into some of that, are informed from the autism community. One of the things I will say as well, I'm not able to share it at this time, but if you go to the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University, there's an event guide that is there. And if you think of anything you're doing in your day as an event, whether that is a conference, pulling together a meeting, that type of thing, there's an extensive event guide that gives you a long, thorough list of considerations of visible and non-visible disabilities, and how to structure spaces where you will be collaborating either virtually or in person in order to make them as inclusive and accessible as possible.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful presentation.